If you put these coordinates into Google Earth, you're going to find this. A huge prehistoric monument, its arms extending off into the desert. Over 6,600 have been discovered, from West Africa to Armenia to Kazakhstan, but the most elaborate are found here in the Middle East, particularly Jordan. They're called desert kites. In terms of size, they've got to be some of the largest prehistoric monuments ever made, and yet I think they're quite unheard of. Today we're going to take a look at these and some other less famous prehistoric monuments. Each of these I've been planning to make a video on in their own right, but that hasn't happened yet, and I just need to get this information out of my brain. These are some incredible ancient monuments you might not know. Our story begins in 1914. Tensions amongst European powers were building in anticipation of World War I. And the British government hired archaeologist Leonard Woolley and a young chap called Thomas Edward Lawrence to conduct a survey of the Negev desert. Officially, this was an archaeological survey, but unofficially, the British government wanted updated maps of the region. For any Ottoman army attempting to invade British-controlled Egypt would have to travel through that area. Lawrence and Woolley described long and puzzling walls, like those elsewhere in the Negev, appear to start and go on and end so aimlessly. In one place it is broken by plain openings, flanked internally by a square enclosure a few feet each way, like a pound or temporary shelter. Its purpose is mysterious. Lawrence would of course go on to become Lawrence of Arabia, perhaps Britain's most famous World War I hero. And as technology progressed and flying became more prevalent, the true scale of these monuments would be revealed. British pilots in the 1920s gave them the name desert kites because, they kind of looked like kites. Their purpose eluded Lawrence. He had wondered whether they were used to herd camels in some way. Others have wondered if they were Roman fortifications or religious sites. However, archaeologists now believe these are enormous hunting traps. Okay, let's describe these kites. Let's pull one up here. The walls of these kites are pretty small, deceptively small. Many are about 40 to 50 centimeters high. They've probably sunk a bit since ancient times, but maybe they were 60, 70 centimeters, less than a meter, it seems, the height of these walls. The base of these enclosures are very, very wide. An animal entering one probably has not even realized they've entered a trap, and yet they have. As they move further and further down, some element of the ibex's mind, of a deer's mind, compels it to follow these lines further and further, narrower and narrower into this trap. Even though at any point they could jump over these walls, they just don't. They just won't do it. Eventually, at the end, they reach the final enclosure. There is nowhere else to go. Maybe they are being driven by humans and dogs into this area, and they are compelled to jump. Escape eludes them, though. The walls here are built just high enough that the gazelle cannot see the 2-meter pit, and they're trapped. They're trapped in this pit which they cannot get out of. It's an incredibly simple trap, and one that relies on a very intimate understanding of the gazelle and the deer. You know that they cannot help but follow these lines. They must have been incredibly effective. In fact, it's possible that they contributed significantly to the extinction of animals in the area. The amount of physical effort it took to make these kites is astounding, really, piling up rock after rock for miles and miles through the desert. It's incredible. Old YouTuber Stefan, who spends way too much time sat at this desk, finds it pretty intimidating. But I am getting fitter thanks to today's sponsor, Trainwell. Trainwell is the best way to do strength training. It's a super convenient one-on-one training service, personalized training service. My trainer was Rod. Hi Rod, how are you doing? I honestly really loved having the plan that Rod created for me. I've exercised more times in the past 3 months than I have in the past 10 years. And that's literally not an exaggeration at all. Halfway through an exercise, just wanted to show you one of my favorite features. It shows you how to do the exercise. I find the less I have to think about what I'm going to do, the more likely I am to do it, the more likely I am to exercise. In the past, I've had the urge to get fit and I've signed up for a gym, and basically I didn't do anything. I would go there, not know what to do, not have a cohesive plan, and just do the running machine or the rowing machine and that would be it. But Rod created a custom plan for me to reach my goals. If I ever had a question, I could just message him and he'd help me out, no problem. But just as important, there's some accountability there. When you're working with another person, I think you're just gonna exercise more. That's, for me anyway, 100% the case. Another exercise, Dad.
Is that tiring?
Really tiring, daughter.
Why did you call me daughter?
Super easy to get going. Just fill out the quiz so Trainwell knows your goals and where you're at the minute. They'll match you with a trainer. You'll have an onboarding call. At any point you can switch your trainer, by the way, so don't think you're locked into anything. And boom, you're away. So if you're planning on building a monument for miles through the desert, or you just want to finally be consistent with fitness, check out Trainwell. You can scan the QR code. There's a link down below. You will get 14 days of free training. So huge thanks to Trainwell for sponsoring the channel. It's just how humans are meant to live, guys. We got to use our bodies. Now, it has to be said, very few faunal remains have ever been found in these pits. So how do we know that this is what happened and that wasn't just a story I made up? It's basically down to deduction and ethnographic records of this hunting practice. If these were animal enclosures, they would have to be fenced off in some way, and we just don't see any evidence of that. Also, why dig the pits all around it? Why construct these elaborate star-shaped monuments? It's not really necessary to herd animals into that. But as I said, we have these really intriguing historical and ethnographical accounts of them being used this way. He is the strongest on the steppe. The pits which I dug, he has filled in again. The traps which I set, he has torn up. He helps the game and animals of the steppe to escape out of my hand, and does not allow me to catch the game of the steppe. That was from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Here, a villager is lamenting the fact that the hero Enkidu has destroyed his hunting traps. And although we can't be 100% sure that the villager is describing desert kites, the description of pits and traps being torn up, it does sound like that. It does sound like that. This style of hunting, of driving game into a pit or enclosure, or even in North America over the edge of a cliff, a buffalo jump, is very well documented. There's even evidence of Neanderthals driving prey into marshy areas and against cliff faces, things like that. These desert kites are certainly not as old as Neanderthals. The Epic of Gilgamesh is probably around 4,000 years old, so that could be good evidence of the practice persisting at least that long ago. But archaeologists excavating these pits have found good evidence of them being much, much older. So this, what you're looking at on the screen now, is an engraving of a kite from Jabal al-Khashabiyya. Certainly didn't say that right. My apologies. It was found on this pillar. Radiocarbon dates from where this pillar was found dated the site to about 10,000 years ago. It wasn't a disturbed context, but charcoal from the neighboring pits where these desert kites are, from the bottom of these pits, came back about 7,000 or 8,000 years old, I believe. So these kites have seemingly been in use since the beginning of the Neolithic. These are very, very old monuments, some of them, and they've been used right up until the 19th, 20th century. It's kind of incredible how long they've been in use in this area. One thing I wonder, and I haven't been able to find an answer to this, so this is, suppose, my own personal speculation. I feel like I read it somewhere, though, and then when I came to write the script for this video, I just couldn't find the source. So if I'm copying someone else's idea, I apologize. But I wonder what role these kites played in the domestication of animals. These are, after all, being produced in the region where agriculture and domestication first occurred, the Neolithic Revolution, if you want to call it that, first occurred in this area. I don't know. I have no way of proving this, but it is interesting that these huge hunting traps designed to control and funnel animals into a specific place existed in the same region where the domestication of animals probably occurred too. It's interesting. Is that process connected in some way? I don't know. But yeah, these are arguably the largest monuments produced in prehistory in terms of geographical area, and they should be more famous. They're very, very cool. Onto our second monument. This time we're over in Europe. The south of Spain is home to some really famous Neolithic monuments. Maybe this is just my bias coming from Britain, but I feel like Britain and Brittany, our Neolithic monuments get a lot of attention. They're very cool, very famous, but the south of Spain is also home to some absolutely incredible stuff. The Tholos of Romeral, a spectacular passage grave, stunning interior roof, all those little rocks holding the roof up like that. There's the Dolmen of Viera, another tomb, presumably, but this one has really interesting carved doors that form the entrance into the interior space. I've honestly never seen anything like that before. It's almost like something out of an Egyptian tomb. But the one I really wanted to chat about was the Dolmen of Menga. This is absolutely a contender for prehistoric Europe's greatest architectural achievement. It really is. First innovation here, architecturally. It has a really wide open space supported by 3 columns. I truly don't know any Neolithic monument with that architectural innovation. The interior spaces are usually pretty small and cramped. For it to be so open and supported by beams, that's a real innovation there. That's sophisticated stuff. The columns are supporting 5 capstones, the largest of which at the back of the tomb weighs a shocking 150 tons. This is the second largest rock ever moved by anyone in Neolithic Europe. The largest one being the broken menhir of Ergra in Brittany, which was estimated to have weighed 330 tons and stood 23 meters tall before it fell down and broke. It fell down and broke in prehistory, by the way. We're pretty sure of that because pieces of it ended up being used in other nearby Neolithic monuments. Very interesting site. One for another day, though. We're doing the Dolmen of Menga here. Still, 150 tons for this Dolmen of Menga. That's an enormous rock. I can't move that. These rocks were all dragged about 1 kilometer from the quarry where the tomb is now. And the tomb sits below this quarry. There's a gentle 22-degree slope between the quarry and the tomb. So it would have just been a matter of moving the rock on a slider, perhaps, the 1 kilometer down to the tomb. I say that as if it's easy. Oh, only rolling it down the hill. Still very difficult to do. Each of the side blocks was placed in a deep foundation, seemingly in some areas about 2 meters deep, 1 meter to 2 meters deep. And yeah, the 5 giant roof slabs were balanced over these columns. The engineering and the architectural thought doesn't end there, though. Clearly, the site selection was very important to them, not only because it was downhill of the quarry, but also because it points towards a very dramatic mountain called La Peña de los Enamorados. It's basically impossible for me to imagine that this orientation is accidental, considering the effort that would go into constructing these Neolithic monuments. It can't be accidental. Lots of Neolithic activity has been found at this mountain, including faint traces of rock art. It's impossible for me to believe that these are not all connected in the same ritual landscape, I suppose. As with many Neolithic monuments, the dolmen also serves as a kind of calendar. These people were, of course, farmers. They needed to know the times of the year to plant crops, harvest crops, get together for various activities. They needed to know what time of year it was. During the summer solstice, the right side of the interior wall is entirely lit up and the left side entirely in shade. So again, just the amount of forethought that went into this monument, downhill from the quarry, pointed towards this prominent mountain. It has to be constructed in a way that these columns can support the roof, and it has to serve as a calendar. It's incredible. It's really an absolutely fantastic Neolithic monument, and for sure one of prehistoric Europe's greatest architectural achievements. Last little mystery, though. There is kind of a mystery here. At the back of the dolmen, behind the last column, sits a well. I couldn't see how deep this well is, but it's meters and meters deep. What did this water mean to them? Was it constructed at the same time as this tomb? Was it a later addition? I suppose that's impossible to date, but the assumption has to be that it was built at the same time, right? When the dolmen was first opened in the 19th century, hundreds of bodies were in there. It was certainly a burial place. What did this... I just can't help but imagine what this water meant to people. If I had to go and fetch water now, modern Stefan, rational Stefan, but I had to go and get a drink, stepping over hundreds of dead bodies, that water is giving me the heebie-jeebies. That's just not a normal cup of water, even now with my modern worldview and everything. So I can't help but imagine it meant something significant to them too. What exactly? We'll never know for sure. Certainly we will never know for sure, but it's an absolutely spectacular monument. Absolutely spectacular. Should be more famous, that's it. Over to the other side of the world now, to the vast grassy expanse of the Eurasian steppe, specifically Mongolia. Still home to many nomadic people living traditional ways of life, with a couple of mod cons, no doubt, here and there. Interrupting this vast expanse of grass are these granite pillars. They're called deer stones because typically they have deer carved into them. This little red one here is a beautiful example. You can clearly see the very elaborate deer, their enormous antlers curling away from them. For a long time, nobody was sure who made them or when they dated to, but with the advent of more scientific dating methods, archaeologists now believe they date to basically the end of the Bronze Age, the late Bronze Age, sometime between 1300 and 700 BCE, it seems. Believe it or not, these are actually statues of people. I know they don't necessarily look like that at first glance, but you can clearly see here the belt they have around the bottom. There's sort of a diagonal line at the top marking the head. Circles on either side of them perhaps represent earrings with a sun motif above them. All deer stones have these features, but very, very rarely we explicitly find a face. Only 13 of the 1600 deer stones found by archaeologists have a clearly carved face on them. So it is very rare, very, very rare to have this feature, but obviously again reinforces their interpretation as statues of humans. The faces of these deer stones always faces east towards the rising sun. The torso is the part that's covered in these very elaborate engravings. Some interpret them as hybrid deer/birds because of their elongated and open mouths and the fact that they're often sort of pointing up with their legs tucked beneath them. Maybe it looks like they're flying. Obviously, interpreting art is subjective. We can't rewind the clock 3,000 years and ask the original builders what they meant from these, but that's one interpretation. The deer stones are found as part of these Bronze Age burial mounds. Like the stones, the person was always buried facing east. And the deer stone is presumably a very stylized representation of them. The deers perhaps representing a guardian spirit, a guide, something like that is a reasonable interpretation. What's really cool and interesting about these deer stones to me, though, is that they're still like a ritual focus for modern Mongolians. You can find them draped in these blue ribbons, this blue fabric called kadags, and these are kind of altars for shamanic and Buddhist rituals. They sort of serve like connected to ancestor worship, I believe, and stuff like that. It's extremely cool. Very unique works of art. I think not a very famous monument. I first heard about them last year and I had never heard about them. And yeah, absolutely fascinating that these monuments can serve a ritual function for 3, almost 4,000 years, perhaps uninterrupted ritual use. Genghis Khan himself may well have been praying at these stones. It's always so interesting to see a monument adapt to the times like that and still be significant to people thousands of years later. Not just in an intellectually curious way, but in a very symbolic and ritualistic way. I don't know. It's very cool, very interesting to me. Now, it's quite easy to understand why people would want to mark a burial, presumably an elite burial, with this big statue of the deceased. Easy to understand why they did that. But our next monument it's a little bit more mysterious, a little bit more enigmatic. The rainforests of Costa Rica are home to an incredible diversity of plant and animal life, and of course, some really fascinating archaeology. This golden bat pendant was found in the Diqui Delta in Costa Rica's west coast, Pacific coast. It's one of many incredible golden artifacts recovered from the region. No doubt these artifacts drove conquistadors wild, their hunt for El Dorado and all of this stuff. They're absolutely beautiful pieces of art. But perhaps more intriguing than these golden artifacts are these enormous stone spheres. These stone spheres are found in open areas of settlements belonging to the Chiriqui period, or roughly 800 to 1550 CE. But it can't be ruled out that some are older than that. That's definitely a possibility. Before they're excavated, they're often almost totally buried. This wasn't deliberate on the part of the people who made them. They just exist in a river delta that floods regularly and has flooded many times in the 1,000 years since they were made. So why were they made? This is very tricky. There are those who say Atlanteans made them because they're an unusual monument in Central America. There also is this idea that they're perfectly round, perfectly spherical. This is based on a misreading of the original study of them that came out in the 1960s that was just measuring their diameter. It wasn't measuring the smoothness of the surface, the roundness of the surface. It was just measuring their diameter. But even if you don't break out the measuring tape, you can kind of see with your own eyes that some of these are not perfectly round. So if it wasn't a long-lost civilization, Atlanteans, something like that, then why make them? We just don't know. From my understanding, 14 is the most that have ever been found in one specific spot. These spheres were made from volcanic rock that was moved several kilometers from where they were eventually made and rested. So they were also placed in visible spots, prominent spots within these villages. They were on public display. So one hypothesis is that they're just kind of for elite display. The bigger the stone you could produce, the more resources you could presumably marshal, and the more important you therefore were, or the more important your village or town was. That is a bit of a cop-out explanation because humans do that all the time, and objects that are for display often have alternate meanings behind them too, right? Like Westminster Abbey was built for display to show how rich and powerful the English king was, but it's also connected to the whole religious worldview of Christianity, right? So these spheres, I imagine, must have had another meaning to the people who produced them. We just don't know what it is. We just don't know. Some have hypothesized that it might represent celestial bodies, others that it might represent Earth in some way, center of the Earth. There are a few hypotheses. I just don't know that we have any way to test them. Yeah. Very interesting, very fascinating monuments. Very cool. If you're in Costa Rica, you got to check them out. Okay, final site. Have you ever struggled to get the lid off a jar? Not me, of course, because I'm incredibly strong. But I would struggle with these. I would really struggle with these. In central Laos, there are fields of these giant megalithic jars that sit on top of hills in prominent locations. The largest are about 3 meters tall, with some others that are about 1 meter tall. There's 3 main archaeological sites that sometimes get called the Plain of Jars. You might have heard of that. The Plain of Jars and these 3 sites are just the most famous example of this phenomenon, which covers an area of 10,000 square kilometers, I believe, across central Laos. There's a lot of these things. I think 93 sites have been found so far. Most sites have under 20 jars, and then there are a lot that have sort of 20 to 60, and then some even have 200, 300, 400 jars. Thousands of these things have been made. Thousands. One interesting thing that I learned in reading about these is that they're never decorated except for one. Only one out of so many has ever been found decorated. They do have rims, so it's believed that they one time had lids. Occasionally, very occasionally, you do find one with a stone lid, but the vast majority have no lid, and it's presumed it was made out of perishable materials, wood, maybe some sort of basket, netting, something like that. They haven't survived to present day. So what were they used for? When were they built? Who built them? These are all the usual questions. Probably not a surprise to you guys, but it's connected to burials in some way. Many of these jars, bodies are often found around these jars, sometimes themselves within smaller ceramic jars, sometimes buried alongside them, sometimes cremated remains, things like that. As for how old they are, this is where the mystery kind of starts. It's basically impossible to date stone, right? You could date the stone and it would tell you when that stone crystallized, but it couldn't tell you when someone carved that stone. I did see this very interesting study attempting to date these jars. So what they did, they used a technique called OSL dating, which tests when certain minerals were last exposed to light. Interestingly, in this study, 2 of the results came back as the sediment last being exposed 40,000 years ago, which is crazy old, crazy old. Before any Lost Civilization folks get too excited, remember, you're not really dating the jars with this technique. You're dating a point at which a mineral was last exposed to light. And that could have been at any time right before the monument was put on top of it. Results from 7 other jars clustered around the 3,000 to 4,000 year mark, and there was another one which came back at around 8,000 years old. So the dating is a mixed bag. It really is a mixed bag, but most of them cluster around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. Artifacts associated with others seem to have been from the Iron Age in this region, so again about 3,000 years ago, something like that. That's probably the time period we're looking at. Now, interestingly, the same study also radiocarbon dated human remains that were found around these jars, and these people lived between the 9th and the 13th century AD, CE, so long after these jars were made, perhaps. Like the deer stones, this could really be a case of a ritual being carried out for a long, long time. The same sites being visited over and over again. And arguably, this tradition still continues, which was very interesting to me. So next to Laos is, of course, Thailand. And in Thailand and Cambodia, I believe, the royal families have this ritual of being placed in these very large containers, which I call them kots. This kot here that you're looking at belongs to the Thai ruler Chulalongkorn the Great. The bodies of these Thai rulers and elite people, Thai royalty, are kept in these containers for up to 100 days sometimes, before they're then removed and, secondary burial practices are taken out. Other rituals are carried out. So it's possible that these jars across Laos served some similar function, that this was a place where you put a body for a certain period of time whilst you carried out the rituals required to send them off, give them a good send-off, and then the body would be removed and disposed of in another way, a secondary burial. That's basically, it seems, the hypothesis at the moment. As for the culture that produced them, we don't know. Archaeologists are not confident that they have located any settlements associated with these jars, which is very interesting. It is very interesting. Perhaps the biggest obstacle to our understanding of these jars is the fact that excavating in this area is incredibly difficult, for sadly modern political reasons. Laos was bombed extensively during the Vietnam War. The USA was attempting to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail that was delivering weapons from North Vietnam to the Viet Cong in the south. Over a 9-year period, an estimated 260 million bombs were dropped on Laos, many of them tiny cluster bombs. It's perhaps the most bombed region of the entire planet. Certainly a contender, sadly. Before excavating any area, it has to be totally cleared of explosives. It's very dangerous, very time-consuming work. According to this Guardian article I found, since the end of the Vietnam War, 20,000 people in Laos have died from unexploded bombs and 63 accidents in 2021 alone. So this is still a real problem in the area. Multiple people get hurt every year by unexploded bombs, and that just makes excavation difficult, hard to go around. Doing large surveys, you have to be so careful about where you're stepping. Still, absolutely incredible monuments, thousands of them produced. Maybe you've heard of them, maybe not, but yeah, they're brilliant. They're brilliant. Thank you for watching. I'll try and do a deep dive on all of these monuments in the future because they're spectacular. I just had to get the information out of my head. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes I don't want to do a deep dive. Sometimes I just want to swim around in some mysterious monuments. Thank you so much for watching the video, guys. I hope you found those monuments a little bit different, a little bit interesting. And huge thanks again to Trainwell for sponsoring the video. Get 14 days free personal training when you click on the link over there, down below, QR code. Go exercise, be happy. See you on the next one. Bidoo.